My name is Caleb Merritt. I am 31 years old. And for most of my life, I believed that the people who raised me were simply flawed. Difficult. Hard to love but easy to excuse. I was wrong. They were not flawed. They were calculating. And the difference between those two things cost me everything I had spent a decade building, until the day I found the document they never expected me to find. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning because this story does not start with betrayal. It starts with a funeral. My grandfather, Raymond Merritt, died on a Thursday morning in October. He was 82 years old, sharp until the end, and the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and meant what he said with his mouth. He had worked 30 years at a paper mill in Asheville, North Carolina, lived in the same house his entire adult life, and saved money the old-fashioned way, slowly, carefully, and without ever touching the principal. When he died, he left behind a paid-off house, 2 trucks, a workshop full of tools, and a life insurance policy worth $310,000. He also left behind a will. I knew about the will because Raymond had told me himself. 2 summers before he died, we were sitting on his back porch watching the sun drop behind the ridge, and he turned to me with a mason jar of sweet tea in his hand and said something I wrote down that same night in a journal I still have. He said, "Caleb, I am not giving my money to people who spent their lives waiting for it. I am giving it to the one who never asked." I was that one. I had never borrowed from him, never hinted, never sat at his dinner table calculating. While my father, Dennis Merritt, had been asking Raymond for loans since I was in elementary school, while my Uncle Gary had spent 30 years treating Raymond's house like a hotel and his generosity like an ATM, I had been the grandchild who showed up just to show up, who mowed the lawn without being asked, who drove 4 hours each way when Raymond had his hip replaced so he would not wake up in a hospital alone. Raymond knew the difference. So did my father. Which is why, when the will was finally read, what happened next was not a misunderstanding. It was a crime. The reading took place at a law office in downtown Asheville on a cold November morning. I drove up the night before and stayed at a motel near the highway. I did not sleep well. I kept thinking about Raymond, not about the money but about the man. The smell of his workshop. The way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. My father and Uncle Gary were already seated when I arrived. My father had dressed like he was attending a job interview. Gary was wearing a boa tie I had never seen before. My Aunt Deborah, Gary's wife, sat beside him with her hands folded and her eyes moving around the room like she was calculating square footage. The attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Caldwell, read through the standard language first. Then he got to the part that mattered. Raymond had left the house and both trucks to be sold, with proceeds divided equally among his 3 adult children. My father Dennis, Uncle Gary, and my Aunt Patricia, who lived in Phoenix and had not made it to the reading. The tools and personal belongings were to be distributed by a designated list Raymond had written himself. And the life insurance proceeds, the full $310,000, were to be placed into a trust and distributed to me, Caleb Raymond Merritt, upon my 35th birthday, or earlier if I used the funds to purchase a primary residence. I remember the exact feeling in the room when Mr. Caldwell said my name. It was not surprise. It was something colder than that. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Gary exhaled through his nose. Deborah looked at her hands. They had known. Or they had suspected. And now they knew for certain. Mr. Caldwell explained the mechanics. The trust would be administered by a third-party firm Raymond had already engaged. It was structured, protected, and legally airtight, or so everyone believed. After the meeting, my father hugged me in the parking lot and said, "Well, Raymond always did have a favorite." He said it like it was a joke. It was not a joke. I went back to my life in Charlotte and tried to let things settle. I worked as a project manager for a mid-size construction company. I had a decent apartment, a reliable truck, and a savings account I had been building since I was 22. The inheritance would have changed things significantly. Allowed me to buy a house years ahead of schedule. Maybe start the small renovation business I had been planning for half a decade. But I was not counting on it. Raymond had said the money was mine, and I believed him. 3 months passed quietly. Then the calls started. First, it was my father, asking if I had heard anything from the trust company. I said no, which was true. He said he was just curious, that he wanted to make sure the process was moving along, that he was looking out for me. I thanked him and thought nothing of it. Then Gary called and said essentially the same thing, almost word for word, which should have told me something. Then my father called again and asked if I had received any paperwork from a company called Piedmont Estate Services. I said I had not heard of them. He said Raymond had used a different firm than originally planned, something about a last-minute change, and that I should expect documents soon. I wrote the name down. Piedmont Estate Services. I looked them up online that evening. They had a website, a logo, a phone number, a list of services. But the business had only been registered in the state of North Carolina 4 months earlier, 2 months before Raymond died. Something tightened in my chest. I called Mr. Caldwell the next morning. He sounded confused when I mentioned Piedmont Estate Services. He told me very carefully that the trust administrator Raymond had designated was a firm called Cornerstone Fiduciary in Raleigh. He had never heard of Piedmont, and the trust, as far as he knew, was active and intact. I asked him to confirm in writing that the trust documents on file had not been modified since Raymond signed them. He said he would check and get back to me. He called me back 4 hours later, and when I heard his voice, I knew. He told me that approximately 6 weeks after Raymond's death, an amendment to the trust had been filed with a notarized signature. The amendment redirected the distribution. Instead of going to me at 35 or upon home purchase, the funds were to be released immediately to a joint account held by Dennis and Gary Merritt, described in the document as co-trustees of Raymond's informal estate. Mr. Caldwell said the signature on the amendment appeared to be Raymond's. Raymond had been dead for 6 weeks by the time that amendment was filed. I sat in my apartment for a long time after that phone call. Not crying. Not shaking. Just sitting with the specific kind of quiet that comes when something you did not want to believe becomes something you cannot avoid. My father and uncle had forged a dead man's signature. They had waited until Raymond was in the ground, and then they had filed a fraudulent document to redirect $310,000 that Raymond had specifically and deliberately kept away from them. They had looked at a dead man's final wish and decided their need for the money was more important than his last act of love, and they had signed his name. I thought about Raymond telling me I was the one who never asked. I thought about my father's hug in that parking lot. About the calls asking if I had heard from the trust company. Not curiosity, I realized now, but surveillance. Checking whether I knew yet. Measuring how much time they had before things unraveled. I thought about what it meant that 2 grown men had watched Raymond's coffin go into the ground, and then gone home and practiced signing his name. Then I picked up my phone and called an attorney. Her name was Lauren Voss, and a colleague at work had used her in a contract dispute 2 years earlier, and said she was the kind of lawyer who made opposing counsel nervous before she even spoke. She was in her mid-40s, methodical, and had a particular specialty in estate fraud that I did not know existed as a specialty until I needed it. I laid out everything in her office on a Wednesday afternoon. The will. The original trust documents. The Piedmont Estate Services registration date. The amendment with the post-death signature. The calls from my father asking if I had received paperwork. Lauren listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is not a gray area, Caleb. What you are describing is estate fraud and forgery of a legal instrument. If everything you have told me is accurate, your father and uncle committed multiple felonies." I told her everything I had told her was accurate. She said, "Then we are going to need the original amendment document, the notarization records, and everything tied to Piedmont Estate Services." I asked her what she thought had happened with the money. She said that depended on whether Cornerstone Fiduciary had released the funds before or after we caught this. She made a call while I sat across from her. A short call. Clinical and precise. When she hung up, her expression had not changed, but something behind her eyes had. She told me the funds had been transferred to the joint account 11 days earlier. The $310,000 was already gone. I want to tell you about the next 2 weeks honestly because I think people who tell these stories sometimes skip the part where the wrong person falls apart a little. I fell apart a little. I stopped sleeping well. I would wake up at 3 in the morning running through the same sequence of events. Raymond in his workshop, the reading, the parking lot hug, the calls, the sign name, and I would feel something between fury and grief that did not have a clean name. My grandfather had tried to take care of me. He had thought carefully and deliberately about how to protect what he wanted to give me. And the two people who were supposed to be my family had desecrated that intention without hesitation. I called my father once during those 2 weeks. I did not tell him what I knew. I just called to hear his voice while I knew what he had done, and he did not know I knew. He sounded completely normal. He asked about work. He complained about the cold. He told me Gary was thinking about buying a boat. When we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand and thought about all the times I had given those men the benefit of the doubt. All the times I had told myself they were flawed but not malicious. All the Thanksgivings and Christmases and graduations where I had absorbed their condescension and told myself it was just their personality. They had been lying to me my entire life. They had just finally gotten specific about it. Lauren moved quickly once she had everything she needed. The notary who had stamped the amendment to the trust was a woman named Sandra Purcell, who operated out of a UPS store in Hickory. Lauren sent an investigator to pull her records. It took less than 48 hours to establish that Sandra Purcell had no record of notarizing any document related to the Raymond Merritt estate. Her logbook, which notaries are required by law to maintain, had no entry for that date. Her stamp number on the fraudulent amendment did not match her current stamp. It matched a stamp that had been reported stolen from her office 17 months earlier. Piedmont Estate Services had been registered by a man named Kevin Doyle, who, when investigators started asking questions, turned out to be a former coworker of Gary Merritt's from a job Gary had held briefly in the early 2000s. Kevin had no background in estate management. He had agreed to front the company for a fee. When Kevin Doyle was contacted by Lauren's investigator and informed of the precise legal exposure he was facing, he made a decision very quickly. He cooperated completely. He told them Gary had come to him 9 weeks after Raymond's diagnosis with terminal cancer. He told them Gary had explained the plan in a single conversation over lunch at a sports bar in Morganton. He told them Dennis had been in the room. Both of them. They had planned this while Raymond was still alive. While Raymond was still sitting on his porch talking to me about who deserved what. They had already been working on it. Lauren filed a civil complaint and provided the complete evidence package to the Buncombe County District Attorney's office on a Friday morning. She called me afterward and said, "The DIS office is treating this seriously. Expect movement within the month." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me yet. The money is still gone. Getting it back is the next fight." The next fight started with a phone call from my father. He called on a Saturday casual, asking if I wanted to come up for a weekend before the weather got bad. I said maybe. He said Gary was doing well, that they had both been thinking about investing in some property. Property? With Raymond's money. I kept my voice completely flat. I said that sounded interesting. I said I had been busy with work, but I would try to make it up soon. When we hung up, I texted Lauren immediately. She said, "Good. Let them stay comfortable." Comfort, I was learning, makes people careless. 2 weeks later, I drove to Asheville on a Thursday afternoon. Not to see my father. I went to Raymond's old neighborhood and knocked on the door of his next-door neighbor, a woman named Gloria Chun who had lived beside him for 22 years. Gloria had been at the funeral. She had sent me a card with a handwritten note about what Raymond had meant to the street. I asked Gloria if Raymond had ever talked to her about his estate plans in the last year of his life. She looked at me carefully, then invited me inside. Over coffee at her kitchen table, Gloria told me that Raymond had been very clear with her, in multiple conversations across many months, that he was leaving his money to me. He had told her once that his sons had spent their whole lives waiting for what was his, and he was not going to reward that with his last act on earth. She said she had his words almost exactly because she had found them striking. I asked if she would be willing to put that in writing for my attorney. She said yes without hesitating. On my way back to Charlotte, I called Lauren. She said sworn third-party testimony about the decedent's stated intentions was valuable. Not legally binding but valuable, especially paired with everything else. I asked her how long before my father found out. She said, "Probably when he gets served." He got served on a Tuesday morning at his house. I know because Gloria texted me. She had seen the process server's car from her kitchen window. She said she watched my father open the door, take the envelope, and stand on his front steps for a long time after the server left. Gary was served at his home 2 hours later. By Tuesday afternoon, my father had called me 11 times. I did not answer. His first voicemail started with my name said in a tone I recognized from childhood, the tone that meant I had done something that disappointed him and he wanted me to feel the weight of that before he explained what it was. He said there had been a terrible misunderstanding. He said the trust amendment had been Raymond's own doing, made during a period when Raymond was confused and being influenced by people who did not have his best interests at heart. He said he had been trying to protect Raymond's legacy by ensuring the money stayed in the family, rather than being tied up in a bureaucratic trust for years. He said, "Caleb, we were going to give you your share. We just needed to handle the logistics first." The second voicemail was Gary. His voice was tighter, less practiced. He said this was going to ruin two families over a disagreement about paperwork. He said Kevin Doyle was a liar. He said the notary had made an error in her records. He said if I dropped the complaint we could work something out privately between family the way Raymond would have wanted. The third voicemail was my father again. His voice had changed. The performance of calm was gone. He said, "If you do this, you are done. You understand me? You are done with this family." I saved every voicemail in a folder and forwarded the audio to Lauren. She forwarded them to the DA's office with a note that said the communications could be construed as an attempt to discourage cooperation with an ongoing investigation. I want to tell you about the moment I heard from my Aunt Patricia because it matters. Patricia had been kept out of everything. She lived in Phoenix, had never been close to Dennis or Gary, and had received her third of the house proceeds and moved on. When she heard what her brothers had done, she called me from Arizona at 9 o'clock at night. She did not ask for my side of the story. She said, "I always knew those two were capable of something like this. I just never thought they would go all the way." She paused and then said, "Raymond talked to me too, Caleb. About you. About what he wanted. I am willing to say that to anyone who needs to hear it." I had not asked her. I had not even thought to call her. She had found out through the family network and reached out herself. That phone call meant more to me than I can explain cleanly. Because the hardest part of all of this, harder than the money, harder than the legal process, was the loneliness of being the person telling the truth inside a family that had spent years constructing a different version of events. Patricia calling unprompted was the first time someone in my bloodline looked at what had happened and simply called it what it was. She flew in for the civil deposition 6 weeks later. The legal process moved the way legal processes move, slowly, and then all at once. The civil case was handled separately from the criminal investigation, and Lauren pressed the civil case aggressively because the money had not vanished, it was traceable. Transfers could be followed. Accounts could be subpoenaed. What the financial investigation found was what Lauren had suspected. The $310,000 had moved through the joint account and into two separate personal accounts within 72 hours of the transfer. From there, it had been split in ways that were clearly designed to make it harder to trace. Multiple smaller transfers, one significant cash withdrawal, payments toward debts that had been outstanding for years. Gary had paid off his truck. Dennis had paid a chunk of his mortgage. Neither of them had bought a boat yet, which told me the property idea my father had mentioned was still in the planning stage. The court ordered a freeze on both accounts pending resolution of the civil case. The freeze went into effect on a Wednesday. By Thursday, my father called Lauren's office directly. "Not me, Lauren," and said he wanted to discuss settlement. Lauren called me with the settlement offer. Dennis and Gary were willing to repay $200,000, structured over 4 years, with no admission of wrongdoing. I told Lauren to say no. She said, "I thought you would say that. Should I tell them why?" I said, "Tell them because Raymond was very specific about what he wanted, and I am going to be specific too." The criminal case took longer, but it did not go away. Kevin Doyle's cooperation was significant. The forged notary stamp tied directly to Piedmont Estate Services. The timeline of Piedmont's registration before Raymond died, while Raymond was sick, showed premeditation. The text messages between Dennis and Gary that were recovered during the investigation were not sophisticated. They had not thought about their phones. One message from Gary to Dennis, sent 3 days after Raymond's funeral, read, "Caldwell doesn't know about the amendment yet. We have maybe 3 weeks before anyone asks." Another, from Dennis, sent the day after I had called my father asking about the trust process. He called again. Still doesn't know. Stay calm. They had been monitoring me, tracking my awareness, managing the gap between what I knew and what they had already done. When I read those messages in the discovery documents Lauren shared with me, I sat with them for a long time. Stay calm. My father had been texting his brother to stay calm while calling me on the phone and asking how I was doing. I thought about all the times in my life I had been in a room with these men and not known what was happening underneath the surface. All the ordinary family moments that had a different script running beneath them. I had spent 31 years thinking I just did not understand my father. What I had not understood was that there was nothing to understand, only a pattern to recognize. The criminal charges were filed in the spring. Forgery of a legal instrument. Estate fraud. Conspiracy. My father and uncle were charged together. Kevin Doyle accepted a plea agreement in exchange for his cooperation and testimony. I was not in the room when they were charged. Lauren told me about it over the phone in a very neutral tone. The way attorneys deliver information they know will land hard regardless of how they say it. She said, "Your father and uncle were arraigned this morning. They both entered not guilty pleas." I said, "Of course they did." She said, "Caleb, you should know, the DIS office is confident. The evidence is substantial." I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I had expected to feel something that resolved cleanly, satisfaction, closure, the sensation of a door swinging shut. What I felt instead was something more complicated. Something like standing in a room after a storm has gone through it, and looking at everything that had been rearranged. My grandfather was still dead. He was still gone. He had tried to take care of me, and these men had gotten in the middle of that and turned his final act of love into a legal case. That could not be undone. The charges being filed did not undo it. But it mattered. It mattered that what they had done was being named for what it was in a public document in a court of law. It mattered that the word forgery appeared next to my father's name somewhere official. The civil case settled before trial. Under the terms of the settlement, which Lauren negotiated without an admission of wrongdoing, because that is how civil law works and she had warned me it likely would, I received the full $310,000, plus attorney's fees and costs, plus interest for the period the funds had been held. The total came to just under $340,000. It took them 4 months to liquidate enough to pay it. My father's mortgage payment, the chunk he had paid off with Raymond's money, had to come back out. Gary's truck payment had to be reversed through the settlement mechanism. They had spent some of the money in ways that required them to take on debt to pay me back. Raymond's money, which my father had used to reduce his debt, became debt again on the way out. I do not know if there is a word for that specific kind of justice. It felt appropriate in a way I had not anticipated. I found out about the criminal verdict through a news alert on my phone. Lauren had warned me the trial would proceed without requiring my testimony, since the documentary evidence and Kevin Doyle's cooperation were sufficient. She said I could attend if I wanted. I decided not to. I was in the parking lot of a hardware store in Charlotte when my phone buzzed with the alert. Guilty on all counts. Both of them. My father and Gary both. I sat in my truck for a while. The radio was off. The parking lot was busy with the regular noise of a Saturday morning. Carts rolling, engines starting, people living ordinary lives around me. I thought about the last time I had spoken to my father, which had been the phone call I made after I knew everything and before he knew I knew. When he had been talking about the cold weather and Gary buying a boat, and I had been listening to him with the knowledge of what he had done sitting in my chest like a stone. He had sounded so comfortable. I was glad he was not comfortable anymore. I do not say that to be cruel. I say it because I spent a long time being told that what I felt about my family was my own misreading of them, that I was too sensitive, too guarded, too quick to see slights that were not there. And part of learning to trust myself again was allowing myself to have the reactions I actually had, instead of the reactions I was supposed to have. What I actually felt sitting in that parking lot was relieved. Not happy. Relieved. The way you feel when something you knew was true is finally confirmed by the world. Sentencing happened later that summer. My father received 18 months, with the possibility of early release after 12. Gary received 22 months because of his deeper involvement in the setup of Piedmont and his recruitment of Kevin Doyle. Their attorneys appealed. The appeal went nowhere. I did not attend sentencing, but Patricia did. She flew in from Phoenix and sat in the courtroom and texted me afterward. Her message was short. She said, "It's done." I said, "Thank you for being there." She said, "Raymond would have been glad someone was." I want to tell you what happened after because I think the after matters just as much as the before. I bought the house. It is a small house in a neighborhood south of Charlotte, built in the late 1960s, the kind that needs work and rewards patience. It has a detached garage that I am turning into a workshop. The kitchen needs a full renovation. The backyard is overgrown and full of possibility. I put Raymond's tools in the garage the first weekend I owned the house. I had gone back to Asheville after the estate was fully settled and asked Gloria if I could take what was left of them, the ones my father and Gary had not managed to sell before the estate was frozen. She said Raymond had told her once very casually that when he was gone, his tools belonged to me. She helped me load them into my truck. Standing in Raymond's empty workshop, I thought about the afternoon he had told me about the will, the mason jar of sweet tea, the way the light came through the trees at the back of his property, the certainty in his voice when he said he was leaving his money to the one who never asked. He had been right about me, and he had been right about them. And somewhere between those two truths, I had found the version of myself that did not apologize for existing and did not mistake cruelty for love, and did not confuse obligation with loyalty. I do not have a relationship with my father. I do not expect to. What he did was not a mistake made in desperation. It was a plan made while Raymond was still breathing. It required forgery and conspiracy and sustained deception, and the deliberate use of grief as cover. That is not something you work back from across a dinner table. He has written me 2 letters from the facility where he is serving his sentence. I have not opened either of them. I put them in a drawer. Maybe one day I will read them. Maybe not. Gary's wife Deborah sent me a message through a cousin saying that Gary hoped I knew he was sorry. I wrote back and said that hope and accountability are different things and left it at that. Noah, the people on the periphery of my life who watched all of this happen and said nothing, most of them eventually went quiet. Few apologized. One cousin told me I had been right all along and that he admired how I had handled it. I thanked him and kept him at a careful distance, because people who admire you for surviving a situation you should not have been in are not always reliable when you need them to help prevent the next one. Patricia and I talk regularly now. She came to Charlotte in the fall and I made dinner and we sat in my living room until almost midnight talking about Raymond, about what he was like when she and my father were children, about the specific warmth of him, and the way he had refused to pretend things were fine when they were not. She said he would have been furious about what happened. I said I knew. She said he also would have been glad that I did not just let it happen. I said I knew that too. There is one more thing I want to tell you because I think it is the most important part. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, after the lawyers and the depositions and the frozen accounts and the guilty verdict, I went back through my own memory of my childhood and I stopped being charitable. I had spent 31 years making excuses for my father, telling myself he was complicated, that his own upbringing had been hard, that he loved me in the ways he was capable of loving. I had extended him the kind of grace that I never required him to earn. And what I understood, finally, standing in my new kitchen on a Tuesday morning drinking coffee and watching the light come through the window, was that grace given without accountability is not grace. It is just another word for enabling. I had enabled my father to be the person he was by never requiring him to be anything better. I could not undo that, but I could stop doing it. And I did. What Raymond gave me, more than the money, more than the house, more than the workshop full of tools, was the proof that someone who knew me clearly and loved me honestly believed I was worth protecting. I carry that with me every day. The rest I let go. Not because what they did was forgivable. Not because family is supposed to mean unlimited tolerance. But because I found out something essential about myself in the middle of the worst thing that had ever happened to me. I found out that when someone takes everything from you, you discover what was really yours all along. And what was mine, my judgment, my work ethic, my ability to build something from nothing, my refusal to collapse under the weight of people who needed me to stay small, none of that had ever been in the account. None of that could be transferred at 2 a.m. by someone who thought they had a right to what I had built. It was always mine. And it always will be.